A clerk who thinks he's killed a man is on the run, and he comes to the train tracks just as a train is approaching. Nelson jumps onto the train. What? Luckily, the train is rerouted and Nelson is able to get on. Nelson got on the train because he was starving and the train was full of luncheon meat, expired, and he got food poisoning. The clerk had threatened to kill the boss in 3 days because he hadn't been promoted. The more he thought about it, the more angry he got and tried to find the boss. But the boss was found dead on his desk. Nelson saw the old boss died, horribly wanted to help him ease the pain. OMG, it's not appropriate to put it back in. But once outside, everyone sees him with a blade and covered in blood. On the other side, the real killer comes out from behind the curtains, enters the ventilation ducts and slips away disguised as a handyman. Nelson exits the elevator and pretends to have a nosebleed and runs out of the elevator to meet the killer, but it doesn't recognize him. Nelson threw the murder weapon into the river. On the other hand, the police realized that Nelson was not the real killer. Nelson had already become the killer's character. He wanted to withdraw money, but thought he'd be locked up by the police. So he threw away his bank card and ran to the bus station to buy a ticket for the 2:30 departure to Mexico. The money is not enough, also put the watch on the bus. Driving on the way, the killer is also on the run. The fate is fantastic. At this time, the wanted notice came on the radio, saying that the murderer of the boss had stolen a black Jeep with a flame pattern. The murderer realized that this car could not be driven now, and Nelson's side of the car was driven down by the driver. A watch can only reach here. This walk for a whole night. Nelson thirsty, drink, do hungry, eat mushrooms. Haha. Nelson picked up a flaming black Jeep in the wilderness. It was thrown by the killer in order to avoid the tracking. Nelson drove to the nearest motel, where the owner saw today's wanted newspaper. When he hears that Nelson drove the Jeep, he turns around and calls the police. After taking a shower in his room, Nelson also saw last night's wanted paper. The murderer was driving a black Jeep. Hey, brother, I drove this morning's car. You predicted last night, so well informed. Coincidentally, the killer was living next door, and the police had already arrived. So Nelson went out and covered his face with a towel. Covering his face with a towel, he almost got away with it when the hotel owner identified Nelson. But the police didn't do anything. They all knew what the killer looked like. The killer looked at Nelson's back as he left with suspicion and wariness in his eyes. The killer told his employer he was being watched by an agent he couldn't get rid of no matter where he went. The agent was a very effeminate man. The employer said, Nelson, that's impossible. The killer changes his plans from going abroad to killing Nelson. Which brings us to the opening scene. Nelson wakes up again, and he's being treated in a hospital. The killer followed him all the way to the hospital and changed into a doctor's clothes as a cover. When he went out, he saw Nelson, who had also completed his disguise. After escaping, Nelson was hungry and thirsty and found a water dispenser to drink. When he was full, he set out to survive again. On the way, he met a woman whose family owned a bank. Nelson became the bank's cashier. The killer wanted to sneak into the crowd and shoot Nelson in secret. At that moment, the police arrived and said, the murderer is here. Please be quiet. With one careless remark, two people changed color, and Lynn took advantage of the confusion to get Nelson out of the bank. They bought tickets to Mexico. The killer showed up and abducted Nelson and Lynn. On the way, the killer confessed to killing the boss. You knew about this, didn't you? I knew. I didn't know. Don't pretend you've been lurking around me all this time, reporting my location to the police. Are you an agent of the CIA? They stopped at a tourist attraction. Killer was going to take Nelson and the others out through the top. As soon as he peeked out, he saw that the police had surrounded him. The killer had a hostage to negotiate with. The killer wanted $1 million and safe passage to the border. Bang! Fire! Fire! That's when Nelson attacked to attract attention. Lynn pressed on the killer's wound, causing him to fall from the heights, and the killer was killed. Nelson clears his name, says goodbye to his past, and becomes happy with Lynn and prepares to inherit her family's bank. The movie is over. If you think it's good, please give me a like. I would be honored.